I did make a little sign, but sometimes even that doesn't help. Okay, and tonight's theme of our little talk is going to be guidelines for sharing. Most of you seem comfortable with the format as it is now, so I'm not really planning any changes, but I thought it might be interesting just to talk about the kinds of guidelines that are helpful in spiritual groups for sharing, because I think they help us to think about what it is that we're looking for in different situations to make them more spiritual, to create situations in which we can be more open and vulnerable, or in which we can protect ourselves if we need to. So that will be our theme. Okay, let's begin with a psalm. O God, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from far away. You search out my path and my lying down, and are acquainted with all my ways. It was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, that I know well. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my thoughts. Reach down into the depths of my heart to lead me in the way everlasting. Welcome to this digital contemplative prayer group. This is a place for all God's people. Whatever your beliefs or doubts, you are welcome here. If you are new to centering prayer, just follow the instructions as the session unfolds. You're also welcome to use the silence in any other way that is right for you. Loving God, we ask for your blessings upon this gathering, recognizing that we bring the joys and sorrows of our lives here today. If anyone would like to mention silently or aloud expressions of gratitude or concern for ourselves, our families, our friends, our society, or our fragile planet, please do so now, and don't forget to unmute yourself.
My partner, Rick.
Those in the path of Hurricane Laura.
My daughter's friend, Laura.
I'd like to pray for Cindy and Doug.
I would like to offer gratitude for the strength and guidance I have received during a very difficult period.
God, we trust that you hear our prayers, silent or spoken, wordless or in words. So I'd just like to talk for a few minutes about guidelines for sharing in a contemplative group. This is taken from my book, and I'll show you some guidelines that you can use. Many of you are probably used to using guidelines like these, but for some people they come as a kind of a revelation. These guidelines are very similar to ones that are provided by Contemplative Outreach for use in sharing in groups, and they're also used a lot in spiritual direction. If you study group spiritual direction, you'll go over guidelines like these. And I just want to point out that there are a lot of different kinds of discourse, and so it can be helpful when we're sharing in a spiritual way to separate the way we communicate with each other from the ways we communicate in our regular lives, because spiritual sharing can be intense and even a bit frightening when we reveal things about our inner selves that we may not have ever spoken about before, that can leave us feeling very tender and exposed. And I think we all want to respect each other and ourselves when we're sharing on that kind of level. But there's also a way in which everyday conversation has a kind of a gravitational pull, and it can kind of suck us back into its orbit without our even meaning to. So having clear guidelines for creating a safe environment for sharing with each other and honoring the nature of what we're saying to each other can be very helpful. There are 4 different modes of discourse that we might use at one time or another in a contemplative group. There's regular conversation, and in this group we don't necessarily maintain silence before the group begins. If you want to introduce yourself to the others or just say hi or share, we don't have any rules about that in this group or at the end of the group either. Some of the groups in the meditation chapel do ask that you remain muted when before the group begins, but we don't have that rule. But in regular conversation, we have a very unstructured, spontaneous way of being with each other without any limits on crosstalk or being intellectual or offering opinions or interrupting each other. That's the way we often talk in regular life. So we might have that kind of casual conversation as we enter or leave a contemplative gathering. Then the second form of discourse that we might use in a contemplative group is a religious discussion. If we talk about spiritual or religious topics, sometimes we can talk about something where the content is spiritual, but we're not talking about those things in a particularly spiritual manner. We could have a very intellectual conversation about theology where we might have crosstalks and arguments and interrupt each other and speak in terms of abstract ideas. And there's nothing wrong with that kind of conversation. That might be a kind of conversation that you might have with friends about religious topics, or after you listen to a sermon, or it's a way to hash out what you believe and think about things. But it's different from the kinds of discourse that we use in a group like this. The third kind of discourse I'd like to raise up is the way we speak in Lectio Divina, which most of you are familiar with from either this group or another Lectio Divina group, where we speak from the heart, and we let go of intellectual, studious, or effortful ways of talking and thinking, and we enter into a more receptive state where we're quietly listening for God's voice, or listening for an inner voice from deep within ourselves. and we share from that inner experience, usually using I statements. So our reflections during Lectio Divina tend to be very short and simple, depending on the size of the group and the type of group we're doing that in. They're very simple in this group. And then the fourth kind of discourse is spiritual sharing, which is what we were talking about a little bit more last week, which is closely related to the sharing in Lectio Divina, very heartfelt and often quite structured, but it could be lengthier and leave more room for spontaneity, digression, talking about our experience. And in its greater freedom, there's a little more risk of being drawn back into everyday conversation with its banter and crosstalk. So the facilitator of the group often needs to be attentive and firm to help the group maintain the integrity of the sharing. So let me just share with you the guidelines. Where are they? I think you can see them. Guidelines for spiritual sharing. These are very similar to the guidelines that contemplative outreach provides and that you might receive in a group spiritual direction setting, or they might be similar to guidelines that you use in a 12-step setting. We listen attentively and without interrupting when someone else is speaking. So we're not waiting for our turn to speak like we might be in a more in a situation where there's crosstalk, where we're interested in conveying our opinion. We're in a much more receptive, attentive state. We share from our own experience and not abstract ideas. We use I statements. And part of the reason why we do that is so that we don't convey the idea that we think that our opinion has, our experience has a universal aspect that kind of trumps somebody else's experience. We're not setting our own experience above someone else's. We're being very personal and making it clear that it's our experience and it's subjective. We try to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to speak, but no one is required to. That I've been in spiritual groups where people are required to speak, and that can be a very big difference. I think it creates a lot of safety for those of us who might be uncomfortable speaking, to make it clear that no one is required to speak. Then you can respect where you are in terms of the conversation without feeling you need to push yourself forward or speak when you're not comfortable. We do not lecture and dominate the group time with our own speaking. When I've given workshops on these guidelines, that guideline often provokes a lot of conversation from situations where people have been outraged and upset by the ways they've been pushed out of groups or made uncomfortable in groups by people who do dominate the group time. And in other settings, it may be considered admirable to dominate the group time. So that's another way in which it differentiates this kind of sharing from regular discourse. We do not give advice, criticize, or comment on what others share. Again, we may have the sense that in spiritual settings we're being asked to give advice or try to fix people or help people in some way. So it can be a big relief to us to realize that we don't need to do that, and it can be more respectful of where people are. It can leave people feeling more free to talk about where they are without feeling that somebody else is going to try to change them or help them, or which can make people feel that others are putting themselves above them. And we keep our sharing in the group absolutely confidential. So that's maybe extremely familiar to most of you, but I just thought that I'd review it because we've been talking a lot about sharing and how much sharing we want to do in this group. And I think it's just helpful. I think it's helpful to think about partly because even if we're not going to be doing that kind of intense sharing that requires guidelines in this group beyond our Lectio Divina, just thinking about those guidelines and how they might affect how you feel in a situation can help you to think about other situations in your life and how you might want to structure them and create boundaries that would enable you to be more fully yourself. Because as we move along in the spiritual journey and we're in groups like this one or other groups where you feel a kind of spiritual intimacy with people, you may be thinking about, well, how can I find similar kinds of intimacy in more everyday settings of my life? So using those kinds of guidelines can be interesting to just kind of play around with and see where they lead you. I have a close friend who we meet once a month these days by Zoom, and we have a very structured conversation where we sit in silence for 5 minutes, then one of us talks for 20 or 25 minutes without the other person saying a word. Then the other person offers a few brief reflections on what we've said. Then we sit in silence for 5 minutes again, and then the other person shares for 20 or 25 minutes, and then the other person reflects back. And there's something so safe about knowing that you have your time in which you can allow what is flowing out of you to just flow out undisturbed by the other person's questions or observations. It's often very surprising what happens. It's not, you can set off without knowing where you're going to be taken. And you can surprise yourself when you have that much space in which to talk. And the way you hear other people when you know that you're not going to talk for 20 or 25 minutes, you're just going to listen, is very different, and the things that you notice are different. So that's just an example of, how you could structure an encounter in a way that might be kind of inspired by this kind of spiritual discourse. And the link I sent you in last week's Thursday email, and I'll share it again this week for the Shalem Group Spiritual Direction Workshop. That's another example of a very structured kind of discourse. It's very similar to what I just described with my friend, where you sit in silence for 5 minutes in a group of 4 or 5 people, then one person talks for a set period of time, then the group offers reflections for a set amount of time, then there's another silence, and then another sharing. So there's something about this very structured, boundaried way of being together that leaves a lot of room for the spirit to flow. It seems it's kind of paradoxical in a way, because the spirit blows where it will, so you might think that it might be more spirit-filled just to be very spontaneous, but there's something about this structure. It's like a spiritual ritual. It creates space for spiritual energy to move into your heart. So those are just a few observations about that, and I'll try to remember to put those in the email tomorrow to share with you those guidelines. So let's move into our 20-minute period of centering prayer. Sit with your back straight and your feet flat on the ground or in another stable position. Your hands on your thighs or in your lap. And gently close your eyes and take a few deep breaths. And just notice how you are. Is there anything physical that you'd like to let go of with a little wiggle or a shake? Is there any emotion that you're bringing with you that you'd like to just touch gently with your attention? Set it gently aside if you can, or if you can't, just notice that it's there and part of your experience. And just take a moment to notice who God is for you right now, whatever that means for you. A sense of mystery, community, spirit, energy, darkness, absence, aliveness. Whatever it is for you in this moment, renew your commitment to be open and present to the sacred. And if you like, you can silently begin to repeat your sacred word or touch your breath gently with your attention, using your sacred symbol to orient yourself towards God. And during the prayer period, whenever you notice that you've become engaged with your thoughts, just gently disengage yourself, returning to your sacred symbol if necessary. Loving God, we listen for your voice in the silence. For our Lectio Divina tonight, I'm going to read a passage from Bede Griffiths, and I'll read it 3 times, and then I'll invite you, if you would like to share a word or a phrase from the passage that resonated for you. Listen with the ear of the heart. Some communities may remain very loose. Some may become very close. Each one has to evolve as the Spirit moves it. We must keep that freedom of the Spirit by learning from one another, coming together day by day and discerning, all in a growth process. It is so easy to get into rules and organization, and so to narrow the freedom of the Spirit. It is by learning really to trust the Spirit in our prayers and meditation, and to share this trust with one another, that a new language will gradually form. Some communities may remain very loose. Some may become very close. Each one has to evolve as the Spirit moves it. We must keep that freedom of the Spirit by learning from one another, coming together day by day and discerning, all in a growth process. It is so easy to get into rules and organization, and so to narrow the freedom of the Spirit. It is by learning really to trust the Spirit in our prayers and meditation, and to share this trust with one another, that a new language will gradually form. Some communities may remain very loose. Some may become very close. Each one has to evolve as the Spirit moves it. We must keep that freedom of the Spirit by learning from one another, coming together day by day and discerning, all in a growth process. It is so easy to get into rules and organization, and so to narrow the freedom of the Spirit. It is by learning really to trust the Spirit in our prayers and meditation, and to share this trust with one another, that a new language will gradually form. I invite you to share a word or phrase that resonated for you from the passage.
Trust the Spirit.
Discerning.
Freedom of the Spirit.
Trust.
A new language.
Share this trust with one another.
Narrow the freedom of the Spirit.
Let's close by saying together the night prayer. I invite you to say it along with me with yourself muted. Lord, it is night. The night is for stillness. Let us be still in the presence of God. It is night after a long day. What has been done has been done. What has not been done has not been done. Let it be. The night is dark. Let our fears of the darkness of the world and of our own lives rest in you. The night is quiet. Let the quietness of your peace enfold us, all dear to us, and all who have no peace. The night heralds the dawn. Let us look expectantly to a new day, new joys, new possibilities. In your name we pray. Amen. Thanks for being with us tonight. It was wonderful to be with you.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Lindsay.
Thank you, Lindsay. Good night,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Good
Good
night.
night. Stay safe,
Good night.
Good
everyone.
night.
Night.
Stay safe.
Sleep well.
Thank you.